He fled Cuba at 16 with nothing but rhythm in his bones and a revolution at his back. Within a decade, he'd turned frying pans into instruments, Miami into a dance floor, and Hollywood on its head. Desi Arnaz wasn't just Lucy's husband. He was a cigar-smoking, conga drumming chaos engine who invented modern television, while his real marriage unraveled behind America's favorite one. How does a boy raised like royalty end up sleeping in a rat-infested warehouse in Miami? How does that same man convince CBS to gamble the future of television on a Cuban accent that many thought America wasn't ready to hear? And what drives someone with everything? Fame, power, the love of Lucille Ball, to walk away from the empire he built. Today, Todd Purdum joins me to unravel the genius, the madness, and the determination that made Desi Arnaz into the man who invented television. Todd S. Purdum is a veteran journalist and author whose 40-year career has spanned the New York Times, Vanity Fair, Politico, and The Atlantic. He's covered everything from City Hall to the White House, served as a diplomatic correspondent and Los Angeles bureau chief, and written definitive books on both Rodgers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution and the political drama behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, Todd turns his lens to a different kind of American Revolution, one that began with a conga beat, a redhead, and a dream called I Love Lucy. Let's get into it. Todd Purdum, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course. So I need to ask you about something before we hop into the main course for today, which will be Desi Arnaz. But you wrote a Variety article back in the day about Bill Clinton, and you went into his involvement with Epstein. And this is back in 2008, so almost 2 decades ago. Bill Clinton's been in the news recently for the Ghislaine Maxwell testimony. She recently said that him and Clinton and Trump had nothing to do with Epstein Island, like none of the notoriously deranged stuff. As someone who's been looking into the story, and you started covering it almost 2 decades ago, are you buying the recent narratives of the Trump administration with the Ghislaine Maxwell testimony, the client list, and stuff like that?
Zach, first I should say that the piece was in Vanity Fair, and I simply, at that point, was reflecting the then known published record about Epstein. So I have never done any independent reporting of my own about Bill Clinton and Epstein, and I really don't know anything about it except what I had already read in published accounts. So I'm afraid I can't be very helpful there. But it's not a story that I had any original reporting.
Okay, so you're just kind of gathering the information that was known at the time back in 2008, but it wasn't a
Yeah, my
li-
memory is that Epstein was a passing reference in my story. There was other reporting that I had done, but I think I was simply reflecting what was then had been published and known about it. But I can't say I have anything to add. Really.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just curious because for someone like me who is not in the investigative journalistic sphere, the Epstein came into my window like it did for pretty much everything else, right up to the, being held in the Brooklyn Detention Center and the suicide. And then I go back and I'm like, oh wait, like this guy's had a history going all the way back to the 80s and 90s, and had indictments in Florida back in 2008. So I was just curious, like having at least been privy to those details, if you had any sort of
Yes.
opinion one way or the other. But if you don't, then that's totally fine too.
No, I really don't. Although in an interesting twist, and I haven't ever talked to her about it, the editor of my Desi Arnaz book at Simon and Schuster, Mindy Marquez, was the longtime editor of the Miami Herald when it conducted its pioneering investigation of Jeffrey Epstein. And I have never talked to her about it, but it's interesting that she was involved very much in the path breaking reporting that the paper did on him. But anyway, I plead nolo. I don't really know
Gotcha.
anything about.
Yeah. So speaking of another empire builder, so someone of a more legitimate fashion, what drew you to Desi Arnaz? How did you get into the world of Desi Arnaz?
Well, like everybody of my age, I'm 65. I hadn't seen I Love Lucy in its original run, but I every sick day from school was an I Love Lucy fest on daytime television in those years, and so I was familiar with the basic outlines of Desi Lou and Lucy and Desi's work in television. But in 2020, I had been involuntarily liberated from my job at the Atlantic in the pandemic in a layoff, and I was looking for a project. And as you'll remember, that was a moment in our culture when people were reassessing the careers of particularly creative people, but all sorts of people who might have been overlooked in their own day. And a friend from college suggested that Desi was ripe for rediscovery and analysis of his role in the early days of television and in really, helping to create I Love Lucy. And I started looking into it, and I realized that that was, very much the case. And anyway, so that was the origin of the project.
Was there any piece of information or any story that that made its way in front of you about Desi Arnaz in particular that hooked you in? Because it's one thing for a friend to recommend it to you, but then to spend years of your life researching a book, you gotta be like, "All right, like, there's some meat on this bone." Like, but was there something that kind of, like, hooked you into it originally?
Yeah, fair question. You do have to want to when you undertake a book. It's a marathon and not a sprint, and you
Yeah.
have to be interested in it to sustain it. I think it's the totality of his life, that the story he really had this riches to rags to riches to rags story. He was born in Cuba in a very privileged family. He had no expectation of, having a career in the world of entertainment. He thought he might come to the United States, go to college. He thought about being a lawyer. He was hoping maybe to go to Notre Dame. And then in the 1933 Cuban Revolution, his family lost everything and had to flee to Miami. And he reinvented himself as a self taught musician in his teenage years and wound up in nightclubs and then on Broadway and finally in Hollywood, where he met Lucy. And his story has a wonderful arc. It's a very American dream story in a way. He succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. And then at the height of his success, he undermined his success with some personal demons, principally, alcoholism, that you know made the last part of his life kind of tough.
Yeah, the beginning of his life where you mentioned he sort of went like riches to rags and then back to riches. It's funny because a lot of people like you'll have a lot of rich people today who grew up rich and they do everything to try to disavow their rich beginnings, and I thought it was funny because in the book, he was like, "No, no, like, I was gonna be a trust fund kid, essentially, like, I was on that track, I would've been totally okay with that, and then I just got cut off to from everything to nothing with the Cuban Revolution, which we'll get into, and so he had to, like, uh, willfully work his way back into the world that he could have been a part of anyway, but not in the creator sense. He might have worked his way in as, like, a finance guy or just, like, a lawyer or something like that. Yeah,
I think one of the interesting things is it's the trauma of losing all that at a young age that, in some sense, gave him the drive. That gave him the drive and a certain fearlessness because he thought, if I've lost everything, why don't I risk everything? And what are they going to do? What's the worst that could happen to me? I'd lose everything again. And that's part of what gave him this enormous confidence and determination to succeed. I think the flip side of that is it's also probably what gave him what we'd now maybe think of as PTSD and a kind of unprocessed amount of trauma that in the end, made him vulnerable to some of these demons that haunted him because he'd really seen things that no teenage kid should really have to see: his home destroyed, his life upended,
yeah,
people killed, their heads on spikes, and so on.
yeah,
So I think it's a two pronged reality of his life.
yeah. To take a step back before he lost everything, you describe him as being raised as a prince in Cuba. Can you talk about the connections that his family had, the positions his family occupied in, and just like the kind of like set the bed for the opportunities that were like in his life before everything went to shit.
Yeah, he was an only child, which was a rarity in the Catholic culture of his day and age. His father was the mayor of Santiago de Cuba, the second largest city on the island after Havana, and later a congressman. His grandfather was a physician who, according to family lore, had been with Teddy Roosevelt going up San Juan Hill in the Spanish American War. His mother's father was an executive at the Bacardi Rum Company, and she had once been decreed to be one of the 10 most beautiful women in Latin America. So he was raised in a big house in Santiago with a country farm and also a summer vacation house on a small island in the bay. And he had, horses and boats and cars and hot and cold running girls. And he was a pretty lucky guy. And he had a rather blithe and blissful life up to the point when he was about 16, 17 years old. So, I think one of the things that that upbringing did for him, it gave him a certain confidence that even when he'd lost everything financially and had to come to the United States as a refugee, he knew that as Jesse Jackson used to say, he was somebody. He had a sense of self that had been drilled into him from a very early age, and I think he was able to, roll with the punches in later life because he had a certain uh, confidence instilled in him uh, by virtue of his birth and the fact that he was a prominent guy in a
Yeah.
the pond where he was swimming.
Yeah, it seems like the initial the initial having of the luxury, the like, basically all the signals in Desi's life that you are somebody, the schooling, the relationships with his family, the government positions, like all these things telling him like you're gonna be someone someday. I feel like that instill like you said, it instills a drive in someone that they have to get back there, like you once knew it, and he knew
Yes.
it well into his, adolescence, as opposed to growing up poor. You don't really have any signals that, "Oh, yeah, like, you're supposed to try to go be someone," if you know if all you know is poverty growing up. So it seems like that really instilled a drive in him to accomplish what he did.
Yes, I think that's true. There was a lot of motivation to get back what he had lost. At the same time, well, I think it's fair to say that for his whole life, his father was a very egotistical, very domineering, successful guy. And I'm not sure that either Desi's father or mother gave him completely unconditional love. There was a lot of expectation of high standards. And then after his parents got divorced, he was saddled with the care and feeding of his mom for the rest of his life. And that turned out to be kind of a big burden for him. So he had on the one hand this drive, and on the other there was maybe a little hole in his heart from the very beginning that he hadn't gotten necessarily the kind of nurturing that might have made him less susceptible to taking out his problems with drink, for example, in later years.
Yeah, there was also a lot of, early sexual deviance encouragement in his life from his father and grandfather. I think you said in the book that they both had these separate houses where they would keep their girlfriends away from their wives, and Desi lost his virginity at a whorehouse in Santiago, and that was kind of like a rite of passage.
Yes, under the tutelage of his uncle, one of his father's brothers, and
Yeah.
so he grew up with that Latin, man's, expectation of a double standard in which men were allowed to stray sexually, um, sometimes with prostitutes, sometimes with, meaningless affairs as they saw it, that didn't matter to their wives. Their wives were expected to be, of course, totally faithful and, hold down the home front and raise the children and so on. And I think that really created in Desi what turned out to be a big disconnect with the American idea of marriage, which Lucille Ball was entitled to expect involved mutual, fidelity and faithfulness. And he also his early experience with prostitutes um, uh, helped build in him a kind of appetite for commitment-free sex, in which, you know, um, he didn't have serial affairs, as his daughter Lucy told me, with people whose names he knew or who had last names. It was just these encounters, these one-offs with sometimes, paid sex workers. But it
Yeah.
became ultimately, I think, almost like an addiction for him in his midlife years. So, yeah, but he came by it honestly, as that's the way he grew up, and that's the message he got from the males in his family.
Yeah, it's hard to understate the amount of influence that your early sexual experiences have on you, especially when those early sexual experiences are transactional or borderline predatory. I have a friend who, he recently told me this. He lost his virginity in 8th grade to a teacher that was in her 30s. So he was, like, being sought out by a teacher, obviously a very screwed up situation, and now my friend is also in his 30s. He For his entire life, like, he in his mind, he saw himself, like, peak sexually at 13, 14 years old. He was like, "I was, had this experience, and then for my entire life, I was trying to do things sexually to reclaim that peak." And obviously everyone does that in different ways, and everyone has, Desi Arnaz and other people have different sexual experiences, but, like, when you have something that's so, like, shaking sexually at such a young age, I can see how you spend a majority of your life, like, trying to sort of, like, claw your way back to something normal through sex and drugs, and especially when there's a time where, therapy isn't super popular, like, there's not a lot of information out there. It's a lot of messed up things to navigate.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And the director and choreographer Bob Fosse, who did his autobiographical movie All That Jazz, he was raised around a lot of burlesque dancers in Chicago and kind of a sexually charged atmosphere when he was a young teenager, and he was also exposed to the sexuality of older women who were in some cases sort of predatory, and by his own admission, it very much colored um, his expectations about love and sex and life. And of course, it also informed his art, his very, sexually charged dances, which are still very stylized and, a signature of that kind of Broadway razzle dazzle. But yeah, I'm sure it has a very big effect when these things happen to you at such a formative stage of life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a good uh, a good way to not necessarily sum it up, but like sort of like a good flashpoint for the information that Desi was taking in at that age was what a priest said to Desi's grandfather and what Desi's grandfather said back. The priest said, "Ponga el corazón con Dios." Put your faith in God, and the grandfather said, "Ponga el corazón con Dios y el rabo tieso." Put your faith in God and a stiff prick. So
Sums it.
his family had a motto that they stuck by, it seems like, and that was passed down. Yeah. What was what was it like for Desi Arnaz to flee Cuba at 16 years old? What was going on? What was he seeing specifically when he fled during the Cuban Revolution?
Well, he was seeing the violent overthrow of the whole world he'd known, the government that was there, of which his father had been a part. He was seeing the upending of the routines of daily life, the loss of his possessions. And he came to the United States, not really speaking very good English. He told in his memoir about going out to dinner. The first night he was there, his father sent him out alone to kind of cope in the world. And he didn't understand the menu. And he wound up ordering 4 different kinds of soup for his first meal, on American shores. He had to adapt very quickly, and he wound up, going to high school in Miami where he um, bought a $5 guitar at a pawn shop and taught himself, how to play the guitar. He found it a useful instrument of, seduction. As he said, it was harder to carry around a piano than to carry around a guitar and date girls. Um, and he basically was very resilient. He and his father lived for a while in a warehouse. They had a business importing roof tiles and fending off the rats who were their neighbors. And so he really went from having a cushy life to a pretty tough and gritty life, and he coped.
Yeah. Rats are something that defy class when you move to the city. It doesn't matter how much money you have, you're always dealing with rats in your apartment.
And certainly
Uh,
cockroaches, yeah.
yeah, for sure. There's an excerpt from your book that I think beautifully and darkly describes the time where Desi was getting out of Cuba. And you write that it seemed inconceivable to the 16-year-old Desi that the populace of Santiago could have turned so abruptly against the alcalde Modelo, the model mayor, Desi's dad, whose election to Congress they had celebrated only the previous fall. But his uncle explained that in the chaos, a motley crew of protesters and activists were bent on revenge and wreaking havoc, with the city's Moncada military barracks in flames and the local police unable to maintain order. Just as I hung up, I heard a rumble, Desi would recall. I looked up and I could not believe what I saw. About 8 blocks away, just beginning to come up over the top of the hill on our main boulevard, there was a mob of 500 people or more carrying torches, pitchforks, guns, and God knows what else. Mayor Arnaz was either arrested or decided to turn himself in to Havana's La Cabana prison for protection. When Desi and his mother eventually made it to the capital themselves, conditions were, if anything, even worse there. There was only one sight I will never forget, Desi would recall more than 40 years later. A man's head stuck on a long pole and hung in front of a house. The rest of the body was hung 2 doors down in front of Desi's father's house. So to see that at 16 years old and have that stick with you from that time for the rest of your life, I can't imagine what that must be like to basically like shove all of that down and try to live
Yeah.
somewhat of a normal human life.
Yeah, no, I mean, it would definitely, you would be hard pressed to unsee that, get that out of your head, and I'm sure it colored everything for the rest of his life.
Yeah. I feel like you see that with a lot of creatives, like actors, but also athletes that the the thing that colors their drive, the darkness, the trauma, is also linked to their downfall. So there's a small window when you're coming up where you can like fix the things wrong with you, or at least attempt to uh, sort of like dampen the flames of the trauma through therapy or talking about it, like something. But if you don't, then it seems like it overtakes a lot of people. It's like a on both ends, like it gets you at the beginning and the end if you don't take care of it.
I think that's very well put, and a lot of creative people do have the source of their creativity in something troubling that happened to them. Lucille Ball lost her father before she was 5 years old. She grew up in a loving family, but there was a lot of moving around, and she was shunted around at times to different relatives. Her grandfather was the father figure in her life. Her mother was absent for part of her childhood with a second husband. And friends of Lucy's said, after she had died, that what the public didn't understand about this very funny lady was that a lot of her comedy came out, as so often is true with comedians or funny people. It comes out of pain in their lives, and I think your point is very well taken. That this can be reservoirs of material, that
Yeah.
help you, but it also can undermine you if you haven't really thought it through. And there are a lot of there's a lot of evidence of very funny people who have big depressive streaks in their personal life.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like pain was often the glue that held Lucy and Desi together at times where they could have broken apart over the 20 years they were married. I think there's also that line in the book you say, uh, it was something like love making was or fighting was their love making. Like they that was like their love making for a couple of years when they first got together. And,
Yeah.
anyone who's ever been in a relationship that's bonded by trauma, that like fighting feels familiar and you don't like it's like sort of your bond with that other person.
Yeah, I think I don't really explore in depth, but I have to think that their mutual experience of trauma, and unprocessed trauma in particular, was something that probably drew them together. And in later years, for all of their married lives, they each had responsibility for their mothers, and their mothers were, kind of adjuncts of their family, and at various times either lived with them or lived in proximity to them. And I think, yeah, that there's uh, love and pain are then the whole damn thing, as the movie said years ago. It's all wrapped up in one big ball of wax. And I think for Desi and Lucy, sometimes that was hard to sort out which was which.
Yeah. So you mentioned that when Desi gets to Miami, they're living in that shitty apartment, rat infested. His dad is slinging tiles, and Desi gets the $5 guitar. How does he go from playing a cheap guitar to getting involved in the music scene in Miami?
Well, he gets a job with a band at the local hotel in Miami Beach, a fancy hotel called the Roni Plaza, which was a big tourist hotel when Miami Beach in the 30s was a wintertime, getaway playground. And he gets spotted by the Cuban band leader Xavier Cugat, who's known as the king of the rumba. And it would be like being spotted by, a big popular act today. I don't know who the equivalent would be, but it would be like being spotted by somebody very big and very popular. And Kugat took him on the road with him after high school to New York to the Waldorf Astoria, where suddenly he's in the big time. And uh,
Yeah.
and then he ultimately breaks out on his own and gets a job at a nightclub in Miami, where he takes this motley group of musicians and introduces the conga dance, which he'd known from his days in Cuba at carnival time. And he's suddenly the hot stuff of the moment at a time when America was falling in love with Latin music anyway, and he was one of the reasons why.
Yeah, I have a clip of Desi on Johnny Carson telling the story of the first time he played the conga in Miami. I'm sure you've seen it a bunch of times. I think it would be useful for listeners to hear that story because he really does tell it in a colorful way. So I'm gonna
Great.
pull it up.
I said, Cougar, I gotta quit. I gotta get my little band. And he says, you'll die of hunger. Nobody knows the rumba in this country. I says, I'm dying of hunger now. So what's the difference? So he says, go to Miami. And I go to Miami. I said, if I get a job, will you send me a little band? I said, sure. So he said, you can use Xavier Cugat as his Desi Arnaz orchestra from the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. I said, gee, that's great. It's a wonderful start. So I got a little job on there. I says, I got the job, send me the band. And I said, I'll pay you for the use of the name. And he said, all right, how much? I said, same you pay me at first, $25 a week. He took it. That's the payoff. Anyway, every week he said, where's my money?
This is long before Lockheed.
Oh, yeah. So he sends me this group. It's a Jewish piano player. I says, well, you play anything? He says, Mama Inez, the Peanut Wander, things. Now, today, Jewish boys play as good or better Latin music than the Cubans do. But in those days, I'm talking about 1938.
Didn't know from nothing.
Nothing. Now, the drummer was a Spaniard. Now, the Spaniards, they all paso doble. No matter what they play, it sounds like they're playing something for the bull to come out into the arena, Bum, 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 bum. And a violin player, a saxophone player, and a bass player. There's the two Italians and another Jewish fellow.
No Cubans in the whole thing?
Nothing. No maracas, no conga, no drums, no nothing. A violin, a saxophone, the drummer was a Spaniard, and the piano and the bass. And they got there the night that I was opening. And I no arrangements, no nothing. So I open. We play the first set. It was in a hole behind the bar, the little bandstand, you know. I came down the stairs, the guy says, "You're fired." That is the worst sound I have ever heard in my life. And he was right.
You're bad.
He was right. He says, "I would have been better off hiring the Salvation Army." Well, I don't know why, but anything, things get really bad for me, I start to laugh. And I had to laugh like hell, but he was right. It was a terrible sound. So I said, "You can't fire me. I got a contract." He says, "I don't care what you got. You're fired." But he had to give me 2 weeks, because thank God for Petrillo. So...
Are you there?
Couldn't
cancel you pay or play, right?
2 weeks, got off. So I said, let me try to figure out, and I had this big conga drum with me. Now, in Cuba, everybody does the conga in carnival time, particularly my hometown. It's like the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Everybody from the island comes to Santiago, and they do the conga line. It goes on for 3 days, hundreds of conga drums and frying pans that they hit with sticks, and the jackass of the jaw of a jackass. I almost said the jackass of a Joe. I still can't say the lines too well. Anyway, I said to these guys, I bought a bottle of rum. I says, "Drink up. We're going to try something new." I figure I can make enough noise with this thing to cover the band, you know, behind me. And also, who can go boom, 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 boom? You know, I said, to the drummer, I says, "You can go boom, 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 can you? You don't have to make that sound like a paso doble." He says, "No, boom, 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 I can go." I says, "All right." Now, the violin player, I said, I went to the kitchen, got 2 frying pans, gave him the frying pans. He says, "How do I go boom, boom, boom with these things?" I said, "You don't go boom, boom, boom with those. You go ding, 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 digga, digga, ding, ding. See?" He said, "Ding, ding, ding, digga, digga, ding." Now, this is a guy that probably was hoping to be Joshua Heifetz, and he's
Sitting there with 2 frying pans.
sitting there with 2 frying pans and 2 spoons, you know? What did I say?
No, you said it right.
Did I say it right?
I'm going to get it right. I'm going to get it.
Anyway, that's how the conga started.
That's what he told.
My dance of desperation.
That's a funny story.
Room service.
We'll take a break. We're coming right back. Stay with us.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, to basically see your career lighting on fire in front of you and to have the mentality of, I'm just going to rip some shots of Bacardi and, you know, get my band drunk and try to pull something out of my ass and, you know, introduce this dance that no one, you know, hasn't caught on here before. Like that's such a ballsy mentality that, you know, like you can't not make it with that. You're either going to like crash or burn completely.
Yes. And you see what a charming, charming storyteller he was and what an irresistible performer he must have been because, as you say, to go just kind of all flags flying like that is a great deal of courage, a great deal of, moxie there. No doubt about it.
And I think it's it's a great testament to how well Desi holds the room because I'm a fan of stand-up comedy. So I didn't grow up with Carson, obviously. I was more of like a Conan, David Letterman guy, late night. So I would go back, like once I became a fan of stand-up comedy, I would go back and watch Carson clips, and Don Rickles obviously goes on to Carson a lot, and he's constantly taking over the conversation, Don Rickles. Like he'll jump in, like he's hilarious, adding tags to what other people are saying, and I think it's such a great testament to how well Desi holds a room, because Don Rickles is basically silent for 5 minutes as Desi is telling the story. It's like the most quiet I've ever seen him on a couch.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's Robert Blake, Don Rickles, Bob Hope, and Carson, and they all just shut up and listen to Desi, which is a pretty good testament to the degree that he was holding the room, because otherwise, as you point out, Johnny never hesitated to jump in, provide a tag, provide a comment on the story, make a joke, put the person, a little bit off balance. And I think what Desi was doing was clearly working, and they just let it work.
So you were explaining how Desi went from Miami to becoming this darling of Broadway.
Yes, he was spotted in a nightclub in Miami by Lorenz Hart, who was one half of the Rodgers and Hart Broadway songwriting team. and they wound up casting him in a show they were doing in 1939 called Too Many Girls, which, as Desi said, was about football and college and screwing. And he was played sort of a version of himself, a Latin football prospect who was recruited to play football in America, and they adapted the part to take advantage of his skills on the conga, which they'd seen him do in the nightclub, and he became a Broadway sensation and kind of overnight star. And when they decided to make the movie in Hollywood, the director of the show, George Abbott, cast Desi in the movie in Hollywood, and that's how he met Lucy, who had been cast in the movie, and they fell more or less head over heels with each other in love. They were each dating other people. They broke up with their existing girlfriend and boyfriend, and within 6 months had eloped and were married.
What what was their first encounter like? Like, is there any record of them meeting for the first time?
Yes, the first time he saw her, Lucy came onto this to the stage. She had been filming a scene in another movie with Maureen O'Hara, where she was a tough dance girl who'd been beaten up in a fight, and she was disheveled and had a black eye and makeup black eye and all that. And Desi couldn't imagine how this actress could possibly be playing a sweet college girl in the movie they were about to make. Later that afternoon, he was rehearsing a number, and a woman came in a beautiful yellow sweater and tan slacks with luminous blue eyes and blonde hair, as Lucy was a blonde at the time. And he said, "Who's that?" And somebody said, "You met her this morning." He said, "I've never seen her before in my life." And they said, "That's Lucille Ball." And Desi was smitten. They went out dancing with other members of the cast that night. They sat by themselves, never joined the whole rest of the group. And it was a whirlwind romance that from the very beginning was marked by tempestuous kind of fighting and making up, which was a pattern that they lasted for the better part of 20 years of their marriage.
Yeah, it seems like there was a lot of foreshadowing during those first couple years they were together. For example, Desi, when he was on Broadway, this is in New York, he was an enthusiastic customer of Polly Adler, who was the queen of Manhattan's brothel underworld. Can you talk about his connection with Polly Adler and his relationship with her business?
Yeah, well, Polly Adler was a figure, sort of extraordinary figure that you wouldn't really have in today's world where all this, anything goes and all this kind of activity is more or less, sanctioned. But she ran an establishment that catered to the cream of high society, writers and directors, Robert Benchley, George S. Kaufman, they all had house accounts there. She had a library full of first editions by authors who were her customers, and it was a very elegant, apparently, establishment that she kept moving to avoid raids by the police. But this was more than a bordello; it was really a kind of a gathering spot for, the elite of show business and society in New York. And Desi met a lot of important people there, and then Polly Adler sent a lot of her customers to see his show. So it was a mutually reinforcing kind of relationship. But again, it cemented his fondness for having a kind of commitment-free, zipless encounter, that persisted really for the rest of his life.
Yeah, this was back in the day when you could actually enjoy the depraved underworld of being a celebrity without phones and social media, where if you walked out of your apartment, someone didn't just, stick a Snapchat in front of your face. Like, this is, uh, long before those days, for sure.
Yes, and I'm sure that, what happened at Polly Adler stayed at Polly Adler's, and their people were able to celebrities were, in those days, very much out and about in, public places in New York and Hollywood and, every place in between, and they, as you say, there were gossip columns, and there were, roving photographers and reporters, but it wasn't the same as like the cell phone TMZ,
Yeah.
culture. They went out in the world largely unmolested by, people would come up and ask for autographs just like they would today, but there weren't stalkers. It wasn't dangerous. They weren't people chasing them down highways and taking pictures of their kids in school and stuff like.
Yeah. I don't know exactly when that code broke, but it seems like there used to be a stronger code between non-celebrities and celebrities back in the day that if, you know, Frank Sinatra or Desi Arnaz went out to a dinner and they were sitting at a restaurant and maybe there were a bunch of girls around and, not behaving in the most sober fashion, it wouldn't be on TikTok Discover page the next morning with 500,000 views. Like people were like, "Holy shit, this is incredible," but they weren't like, uh, they weren't. It didn't seem like people were trying to capitalize on celebrity interactions to build their own celebrity. It was just, and maybe that was a product of not having the technology. Maybe it was just a different mentality back then. Probably a combination of both.
Yeah, it was a
but
combination of both. They didn't have the digital
yeah,
technology to be their own, sources of information. But also the studios hired all kinds of armies of PR people and they paid off the police to, keep these things out of the papers. And so, but there was you could be sort of in private and public in a way that you can't today.
yeah. It's a weird world we live in today where the major celebrities aura becomes cannibalized into these micro celebrities. So I feel like there's really no like true celebrities that are 30 years old and below, like back in the day. Like every new celebrity is kind of like they're a face, but they don't have the star power like back in the day.
That's fair to say.
Yeah. There's another excerpt that I think paints a perfect picture of the bordello underworld of Polly Adler back in the day. You write that Desi became a customer after he noticed a gorgeous redhead moving past La Conga's bandstand one night. She was one of Polly's employees, and Adler invited him over for a breakfast of caviar, sturgeon, and scrambled eggs. That is an amazing breakfast. With the redhead as a complimentary dessert. A man's visit to Polly's meant more than just sleeping with a woman, Adler wrote. He expected to be amused and even informed. He knew he could count on conversation about the latest plays and newest books. He would hear fresh and funny stories, anecdotes about the town characters, good talk and good liquor, good-looking girls and good-looking surroundings. These were the ingredients which went into the making of a good night, and when the men said good night, although it was usually 5 or 6 in the morning, they really meant it had been. Desi's summary of the experience was less elevated. I've had my share of delicious sex in my life, but that redhead was something else, he recalled. If there was anything I had not learned at Casa Marina, she taught it to me. She was insatiable. That is a hell of a sales pitch by Polly Adler, I must say.
Yeah, and when Desi published his memoir in 1976, it's interesting commentary on what the media environment was like 50 years ago. There was a certain amount of critical pushback that he'd overshared, and that was a little bit unusual for a celebrity to tell stories like this on himself and be so frank about something like his sex life. And now, of course, this seems like a lace Valentine. It seems very mild and really innocent. But at the time, even 50 years ago, when he published that story, there was some pushback that he was, oversharing.
Yeah. No, it's literally the subject of many podcasts is just a guy and a girl or two girls talking about people they've had sex with, and they'll do like 400 episodes on that. So that it's definitely been diluted in today's media landscape. Can you talk about some of the details of Lucille Ball's childhood? Because you mentioned the tragedy. Can you talk about some of the specific things that happened to her growing up? Hey guys, thank you for making it this far in the conversation, which means you're only halfway through the episode. If you would like to keep listening to or watching the entire chat, head over to the Zach Show 2.0 at thezachshow.supercast.com, where you get the full uncut version of every episode ad-free the moment it drops. You also gain access to exclusive AMAs, the ability to suggest questions for future guests, the Zarchives, which are 31 super secret bonus episodes locked behind the vault, monthly essays, and the knowledge that you are supporting a completely independent team of creators. Just me and my trusty editor, Eduardo. If that sounds good to you, head to thezachshow.supercast.com to subscribe today. I'll see you there.